Hello and welcome to everybody joining us today for another webinar as part of our series Innovating with Collections Online, which is being hosted by the Ontario Museums Association and is produced in conjunction with Toronto History Museums at the City of Toronto and supported by the Government of Canada's Canadian Heritage Museum Assistance Programme. And we're lucky today to have a presentation from Brett Laheed, Kimberly Moore, and Kent Davies on building discoverability, access, and versatility into archived oral history collections. And this is being presented from the Oral History Centre, where they work at the University of Winnipeg. And this talk is part of a series of webinars focused on oral history and born digital collections. And so at the end of this piece, we'll also let you know about the next talk in the series. And it's also part of a cohort-based action research program supported by Digital Action Research and Transformation, or DART. And we're working with a cohort of 5 museums sharing expert knowledge and producing on-the-ground case studies that will also be compiled into a toolkit early next year and shared with you, the sector, via Ontario Museums Association. So without delaying any further, I'll pass on to Brett, Kimberly, and Kent to present their talk today. Thank you very much.
Well, great. Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much. And it's great to be here with you all. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Winnipeg and the Oral History Centre is situated on Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, and Oji-Cree nations, and the homeland of the Métis Nation, and that our water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. The Oral History Centre recognizes the harms done to these communities through settler colonization of these lands and is committed to redressing these harms through our work in the spirit of reconciliation. My name is Brett Laheed, and I am the Director of the Oral History Centre at the University of Winnipeg. I'm also the University Archivist and Digital Curator at the University of Winnipeg Archives. And with me today are Kimberly Moore, the Oral History Center's Programming and Collection Specialist, and Kent Davies, who is the OHC Technician. Excuse me. And both Kim and Kent are also adjunct professors at the University of Winnipeg. I would like to begin by telling you all a little about the Oral History Center at the University of Winnipeg, who we are, what we do, and share a little of our history. The central vision for the Oral History Centre since its inception in 2012 has been to become a national leader and global innovator in developing excellence in oral history teaching, research, and collaborative community development, and promoting oral history as a means of democratizing history, and thus of working towards social justice and human rights in a globalizing world. Next slide, please. Our mission at the Oral History Centre is to provide future oral historians with the knowledge and skills to produce useful, usable, and accessible oral history that adheres to established industry standards and best practices. We enable oral history through training in oral history methodology and related technologies in the form of in-class instruction and dedicated workshops. We also offer consultation services and additional supports for oral history projects at the university and within the broader community. Anyone who completes our introductory workshop series is granted membership to the OHC. Membership offers people the ability to use and borrow equipment, reserve the computer lab, book time in the recording studio, or gain additional time to consult with Kim and Kent on projects. We emphasize a campus-community relationship where the center is equipped to transfer knowledge for community-based projects by providing training, support, guidance, and equipment loans to community organizations. Next slide, please. So today we are going to talk to you about archiving oral history interviews and how the work that we are doing at the OHC challenges the perception that exists within oral history theory and literature that posits archiving as the end stage of the collection lifecycle by building discoverability, access, and versatility into the collections that we archive over time. We'll explore how we're working with potential donors using a pre-custodial approach by informing them of the best practices in creating oral history collections that lend themselves towards long-term preservation and ethical and functional access before they are donated to the archives. We'll also look at how we're retroactively applying these approaches to extant collections in our archive in order to facilitate discoverability and access. By taking these approaches, we feel we are extending the life cycle of archived oral history collections that is in line with digital curation and data management lifecycle models that emphasize appraisal, description, preservation planning, access, use, and reuse of born digital content. Next slide, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. As Brett said, my name is Kimberly Moore. I'm Programming and Collection Specialist at the OHC at the University of Winnipeg. So there's always a lot to talk about when talking about doing oral history. Normally, the emphasis of how to do oral history and lines of inquiry about how to do oral history well are in the collecting. So how do we conduct interviews? Who should we interview? How do we do oral history ethically? What should we use to record oral history? What should we create with the interviews we collect? These questions emerge with good reason. Interviews are the heart of oral history. But today we're not going to address any of this. Instead, I want to shift focus and frame oral history collecting, which is to say the interviews within the larger context of an oral history life cycle. This life cycle situates interviewing more broadly within several stages of doing oral history. As you can see, interviewing is only a fraction of the cycle. As oral historian Barbara Summer explained, oral historians present the life cycle in different ways, but the underlying concept is the same. Every step from idea to access and use is related to other steps in the process. The point of framing the process of doing oral history like this is to expand our idea of oral history from a research method in which we generate primary sources into an archival process where practitioners play a key role in the preservation and reuse of interviews. So our questions today are, how do we do oral history in a way that ensures the interviews can be preserved? How do we ensure that the heart of oral history is useful, usable, and accessible into the future? And how do we establish discoverability and access to collections in a way that does not rely exclusively on one platform and thus risks losing pathways to access should that system fail? In talking about the oral history lifecycle, I hope today to outline that the work of preserving oral history in ways that enables reuse is not a one-time, one-person job. There are practitioner responsibilities and there are responsibility of repository administrators, and only when both work together is the life cycle of oral history viable. Brett will elaborate on the digital curation and data management lifecycle models employed by archives, and Kent will elaborate more on some of the technical and administrative processes involved on the repository side, filling in the preservation and access and use segments of this cycle. I will begin with a brief overview of why oral historians have come to emphasize the oral history lifecycle model, what access to oral history means in the digital age, and how practitioners and archives share responsibility for ensuring that preservation and access to existing collections is possible. So oral historian Michael Frisch has pointed out that the deep, dark secret of oral history is that nobody spends much time listening to or watching the interviews. Despite moving forward from the analog to the digital age, there have been a few consistent obstacles. In the early days of oral history, due to the cost of recording media, interviews were transcribed so that magnetic tape could be reused. The oral element eschewed due to expense. The transcript was the primary means of engagement. In the early days of born digital, this problem manifested again, but this time the expense of digital storage and lack of digital delivery systems prevented access to the media. By the time of Frisch's commentary in 2008, media was relatively inexpensive to produce and to store, and the worth of the recording as the primary source was uncontested. More interviews than ever were being produced and preserved, but having the digital media in the archive did not result in increased access nor reuse of archived oral histories. With the emphasis placed on preserving the recordings, a secondary problem became evident. Recordings were being preserved without context and without much detail about what they contained. Making sense of existing interviews was made difficult by a lack of documentation about who conducted the interviews and for what purpose. With no record of the original intent nor documentation of resulted publications or analysis, it was difficult to glean any insight into the conditions of their creation. Further to this, ambiguous or absent permissions regarding both the interview occasion and subsequent archiving of the recordings made access and reuse ethically dubious, and after the advent of privacy legislation, sometimes legally questionable. Next slide. But on top of these contextual and ethical obstructions, there were more practical reasons that researchers did not listen to interviews. Building on Frisch's work, Doug Boyd, creator of the oral history metadata synchronizer, observed that whether analog or digital, the audio player alone poses a cumbersome, inefficient course for a user's discovery and interaction with information. Although the burdens of on-site visits, expensive duplication, and necessity of specific playback equipment were effectively alleviated in the digital age, the fundamental problem of access and reuse has always been one of access to content. One must listen to an entire interview in real time to know whether or not it contained anything of relevance. So despite the elevation of the recording as the primary source and the increased preservation of recordings, and regardless of effective delivery systems, for example, the ability to embed a digital file online, users who seek out existing interviews still tend to prefer interviews with transcripts because it is a standalone resource that is portable and can be perused and annotated with ease. Next slide. While the goal of oral history, particularly in Canada, has long been to preserve recorded interviews, there is scant discussion about how oral historians or archivists should go about doing this. There has not been much to guide practitioners in terms of what work needed to be done to make an oral history collection worth archiving, or within the archive, how to facilitate its use. As Stephen High noted as recently as 2021, oral history training manuals and guides say virtually nothing about how to archive or access existing recordings. Although the Oral History Association published a page on best practices for archiving oral history in 2019, which does provide a helpful beginning, in Canada, there remains additional issues such as a frustrating lack of information regarding things like how copyright and privacy legislation impacts oral history in the archive, what options there are in terms of platforms for access and discoverability, and how the former impacts what are viable choices for the latter. In Canada, while oral history practitioners participate in international conversations regarding interviewing best practices, the ethics of various aspects of doing oral history, and more recently, systems of access like OHMs, there is not the same enthusiasm for dialogue regarding the administrative labor of oral history, determining archival viability of collections, or addressing the legalities and ethics of archiving. This is work that tends to be puzzled out and executed behind closed doors and not often published about. The framework of the oral history lifecycle emerged out of these long-standing issues regarding access and use. It is meant to underscore that doing oral history requires more than simply conducting interviews, and that access to oral history means more than being able to get your hands on a recording or transcript. Next slide, please. So much of our work at the center is focused on working through these problems. Because the oral history lifecycle necessarily includes specialized archival labor, we teach oral history as a three-part process, which emphasizes the practitioner's responsibilities for ensuring archivability before the interview, during the interview, and after the interview. In archival parlance, this is a pre-custodial approach to archiving oral history. In oral history parlance, this is sometimes described as a holistic approach to practicing oral history, where work is done at each stage to ensure the possibility of archiving and enabling an oral history lifecycle. At each stage, there are specific elements produced that are necessary in facilitating access to oral history in the archive. Next slide. Before the interview, preliminary research is conducted and a project proposal outlines the goals of interviewing. Informed consent procedures are established to document permission to interview and to archive going forward. And in addition to establishing the goals of interviewing, a strategy for organizing the interviews and related documents should be designed to keep materials in a nested order reflecting the context of their creation. Key to this is keeping an inventory of interviews. Although simply a spreadsheet at this stage, it is a key component of recording good metadata for your project and keeping track of the labor of oral history as it progresses. Next slide. During the recorded interview, there are technical and methodological aspects that make the interview archivable. Technical aspects include the observation of best practices for the recording medium of choice. So we teach best practices for audio, as regardless of the medium, audio or video, audio recording skills apply. In other words, is it a good quality recording with minimal noise and distraction in which you can hear the narrator clearly? And is it recorded in a lossless archival format? Methodological aspects include a thoughtful approach to interviewing by a well-prepared interviewer, a good rapport between interviewer and narrator that elicits storytelling rather than targeted, narrow fact-finding. Although life story interviews tend to be longer and wider in scope than those with a topical focus, this is a preferred approach with the potential for wider use in an archival context. The interview should also include documentation of informed consent and archival permissions. Although preferable to have signed documents, a detailed discussion of permissions on the recording is also acceptable. Next slide, please. After the interview, there is interview post-processing. Although there's some debate as to whether transcripts are needed in the digital age, oral history best practices recommend interviews be transcribed, indexed, and summarized. After all the interviews are completed, a project description should be written as a follow-up to the proposal. Where a proposal details the intention, a project description details what actually happened. It should describe the research question and the intention of the project, detail how many interviews there are, how narrators were solicited, to what extent post-processing is complete, and whether there were any resultant publications from the interviews. While an organizational strategy should be established in the planning stages, care to make sure it has been implemented effectively should be the last stage of collecting. All documents related to the project file along with the interviews, and all files related to each interview filed alongside the media, transcript, and index. Following these best practices creates more than a recorded interview, but also documents and organizes information in a way that preserves the context of creation. It includes a record of all contributors and metadata, which is information about the participants, time, place, and other such aspects of the recordings. Together, these contribute to solving the problems of clarity in terms of permissions, contextual information about why the interviews were created, and lays an important foundation in addressing the issue of effective media delivery. A spreadsheet that includes all of this information can be exported to a variety of formats and thus imported into a variety of platforms that enable discoverability and access. Next slide, please. Following these steps results in an infrastructure for access that will be platform agnostic. So what does that mean? It means that each collection of interviews will have all the constituent components for establishing archival access, and as such will not be tied to any one platform. The data is interoperable, meaning that these components can be assembled and reassembled, imported and exported into a platform of your choosing without requiring much additional or platform-specific labor. So there are three primary components of access in the digital age that are the responsibility of the practitioner. Next slide. First, legal and ethical access. Does each interview have documented consent? Are there clear permissions for archiving the interview and for making the interview available to researchers online or by other means? Second, digital access. Are the audio files archival quality? And is there sufficient technical and descriptive metadata? Third, access to content. Is each interview filed in a way that indicates its relationship to others? And is there sufficient project documentation that will allow people to understand the original purpose of each interview, lead them to any outcomes resulting from the interviews, and to understand the context of their creation? Are there the interviews fully transcribed, summarized, and indexed as a means of providing pathways into the content of each recording? In other words, do we know what the project is about and what each interview is about without having to listen to each interview beginning to end? Next slide. This pre-custodial model is a product of the digital age in that it works towards solving past problems of access, context, delivery, and reuse going forward. But understanding how the process results in this infrastructure for access means that it can also be applied to existing collections. These components can be used to measure a collection and determine how complete is the collection or how many of the constituent components of access are present. In cases where the standard in each area is not met, we can begin to calculate how much labor, time, and expense it might take to bring projects into an accessible state by asking questions such as, are they missing a few pieces of easily discoverable, obtainable information? Is there a completed web of permissions and context needed? Consigning the project to what archivist Beth Robertson has called the too hard basket? Is there a lack of permissions, context, and issues with quality that make it a candidate for deaccessioning? What is the perceived value of the interviews compared to the labor and resources required to make it accessible and open it up to reuse? Next slide. Although the oral history lifecycle model is a more archivally informed approach to doing oral history, it's infeasible that all the work of archiving oral histories and establishing accessibility be done by practitioners. There are key aspects of preservation and access that are the responsibility of the archive. The work needed to preserve oral history records, including technological infrastructure and delivery systems that can provide searchable resources, is beyond the scope, skill, and budget of the average practitioner. So while the principle of democratizing history asserts that anyone with a little basic training and guidance can do oral history, this is less true about preserving oral history. It is ultimately the archive's responsibility to preserve oral history recordings along with associated contextual records and to establish the fourth key component of accessibility, which is discoverability. I'm now going to pass it over to Brett, who is going to address the archive's role in preservation and discoverability.
Thanks, Kim. So while the goal of the OHC is to make collections accessible and discoverable, it is important to note that this cannot be done without preservation, that these three archival functions are interrelated. As Kim has pointed out, there are few practical resources available within the oral history community detailing how to archive or access recordings. The resources that do exist are not representative of the actions and labor required to ensure archived oral history collections are preserved, accessible, and made discoverable over time. Traditional oral history lifecycle models do not reflect archiving oral history collections as an active, continual process that should begin at the time of formulating an oral history project and does not end upon donation to an archives. Next slide, please. The way in which we at the OHC theorize and practice digital archiving on our oral history collections adheres more closely to the digital curation lifecycle model developed by the Digital Curation Center, or DCC, in the UK. This model extends the lifecycle of digital oral history collections and more accurately reflects the continual, cyclical, and interconnected processes that are performed to ensure the preservation, accessibility, usability, and reusability of the content over time. The DCC curation lifecycle model provides a graphical, high-level overview of the stages required for successful curation and preservation of data from initial conceptualization or receipt. The model is designed to be generic and flexible in order to accommodate the varying administrative structures of the businesses or organizations that might implement it. It does not define or assign roles or responsibilities, nor does it suggest standards or technologies to adopt. It is intended to outline the necessary steps that should be taken to curate digital materials and the sequence in which those steps should be followed in the creation of organization-specific digital preservation policies and procedures. The organization then determines the standards and technologies to utilize and who will be responsible for the work. Next slide, please. At the heart of the model is the data, or digital objects. In an oral history collection, the data includes the interviews, transcripts, indexes, metadata, and accompanying documentation. Lifecycle actions surrounding the data include description and representation information, which is the administrative, descriptive, technical, structural, and preservation metadata, and any other information required to fully understand and render the digital objects, or in other words, the context surrounding the creation and use of the digital objects. Preservation planning, which is the digital preservation plans or policies in place to ensure the content, context, and structure of the objects is retained over time. Community watch and participation, which refers to the digital curation community and ensuring archives administrators remain knowledgeable about developing standards, tools, and software. And curate and preserve, which refers to the actions detailed in the preservation planning documentation to be undertaken to preserve and make the content accessible over time. Next slide, please. The outer layer of the model is the sequential actions that provide the ordered steps required to fulfill the life cycle of the digital collection. The first step is to conceptualize or design a plan of action for the creation and eventual preservation and access for an oral history collection. The second step is the creation or receipt of the digital objects and metadata. Here is where a collection is accessioned, legal donation agreements are signed, and additional metadata may be generated by the collecting institution. Third is appraisal or selection of the collection to ensure it meets the collection mandate of the archive and that the digital objects and metadata are complete, adhere to established standards, and are appropriate for long-term preservation and use. If it is decided that a collection does not meet these standards, it may be disposed of, typically by being offered back to the donor or to another archive or possibly destroyed. If deemed suitable for long-term preservation, the digital content is then ingested into the archive's digital preservation infrastructure where preservation actions such as virus checks, checksum validations, and file format validations are performed to ensure the authenticity, reliability, integrity, and usability of the data is retained. If the data cannot be validated for whatever reason, it may be reappraised to determine how the data may be validated and whether that process is worth the effort considering the value of the content. The data is then securely stored according to established standards and procedures and prepared for access, use, and reuse, whereby access controls and authentication procedures may be applied to ensure interviews and transcripts or portions of them are restricted or redacted according to the wishes of the subject, and the collection is then made discoverable. The final step is transform, where new data may be created from the original data. This might include migrating content to new file formats to ensure they meet preservation best practices and can be continually preserved over time. Or it might include the creation of a subset of data, perhaps creating access copies from the original master copies, which are usually done to standards that are more easily accessible to users and ensures the masters are not put at risk due to use. It might also include the creation of entirely new data from the original, reusing the original in the creation of a new product. Common outputs resulting from the reuse of data might include story maps, podcasts, and other creative productions. This transformed data may then need to be archived, and the cycle repeats itself continually. Next slide, please. As you can see, archiving digital oral history collections is not a one-step process that begins and ends with the donation of a collection to an archives, as espoused in traditional oral history lifecycle models. It is a continual process that begins at the conceptualization of a project and never really ends. And it is a laborious process that we believe should not be the sole responsibility of archive staff, but that necessarily includes project leads and participants in a pre-custodial approach suggested by staff at the outset of a project. Next slide, please. As Kim noted, we work with oral history practitioners and potential donors to assume responsibility for a few of the lifecycle actions before we assume custody of the collection. During an early consultation with staff, in addition to learning about how to do oral history effectively, project leads are informed of our collection mandate, copyright agreements, the required metadata and accompanying documentation, access options grounded in ethics and informed consent, and the preferred file formats and technical specifications required for preservation and access. We will not accept collections into our archive unless they are able to meet these conditions for donation. In this way, oral history practitioners are contributing to several lifecycle actions, as illustrated here. Next slide, please. Following the completion of an oral history project, and if a request for donation of the project data to the archives is made, OHC staff perform lifecycle actions in a post-custodial phase of data curation. OHC staff receive the data, review the collection to ensure it is complete and meets all requirements for donation, accession the collection, transfer the data to OHC servers, perform redundancy checks on the data, store the data in geo-distributed redundant locations, transform copies of the master files to file formats more appropriate for access and store them appropriately, and make the collections accessible and discoverable in a number of ways. Kent will elaborate on this a bit further. Well, we now have procedures in place to enable us to accept born digital collections for which we can be more confident in assuring their long-term preservation, discoverability, access, and versatility. We also have extant collections in our holdings, for which the actions expressed in the DCC lifecycle model have not been applied. We are now working retroactively and post-custodially to establish workflows to ensure these legacy collections also meet these established standards. Next slide, please. And over to Kent.
Great, thanks, Brett. I'm Kent Davies, technician and digital curator here at the OHC. I'm going to talk about the post-custodial workflow in practice when processing extant oral history collections. Post-custodial processing can be a time-intensive, complex, often frustrating experience, but sometimes it can be a rewarding one as well. Many archivists will come across oral history collections that lack documentation and may not have clear rights regarding usage. And we at the Oral History Center are no exception. In 2012, when the UWinnipeg Oral History Center was founded, we began inheriting a number of legacy and extant collections from former directors, U of W researchers, community groups, as well as projects from U of W classes. While some followed the best practices of the three-part interview process, creating transcripts, metadata, and other contextual documents, others did not. Some met our requirements for processing, but had other organizational structures, different naming conventions, formats, and rights agreements. So when building the infrastructure for access with extant collections, there needs to be a collection management strategy where we not only consider best practices, but what is ultimately achievable. So developing a workflow that considers how many of the constituent components of access are present is key. This workflow has helped appraise collections we've inherited in determining priorities of action. So guided by the three constituent elements of access in the digital age, the appraisal phase will guide a collections pathway to access, determining which pieces are missing and roughly how much labor is involved in completing a collection. In other words, is it worthwhile to process, or does it go at Robertson's too hard basket? The first thing we look at when appraising collections is the proper legal release that outlines permissions and ethical use of the collection that not only satisfies the interviewee's needs, but our own policies regarding ethical access. The two big questions of who has the rights to the content and are there signed consent and release forms is complicated by the fact that some legacy collections have release agreements regarding usage that were obtained even before the advent of the internet. So it's important for us that participants understand the implications of online access to their story and grant well-defined permissions regarding access. Thankfully, Kim and the legal counsel here at the UWinnipeg worked diligently to develop retroactive waivers for participants and copyright holders that allows them to determine both the physical access and online access to their records. Of course, there's other questions at this stage. Are there any added restrictions to access? How can we follow those restrictions while maintaining our commitment to legal and ethical access? We've established levels of access here at the OHC, from open, which an interview can be accessed by the public online via our catalog; restricted, where the interview is not open to the public, but a record of the interview is in the catalog to ensure some degree of discoverability. Researchers, family members, and others can request access, but the rights holders are ultimately responsible for granting those requests. And then closed, which the record isn't processed until a certain date, or in some cases not at all. Then we look at a collection in terms of establishing digital access. How much contextual information can be gleaned about the collection? Is there a project description or inventory or content list where one could take stock of the completeness of the collection before surveying the content in detail? Then we look at the collection, the condition of the collection in terms of the quality and the format of the collection, from the physical condition of the media to the quality of the digital content. Some media sources weren't digitized properly. If there's an opportunity and justification to redigitize some materials ourselves, we can and we have. The same goes with audio restoration work. We've had projects where, with digital masters of interviews, but weren't given physical copies of the documents. So what exists physically or digitally as part of a project needs to be sorted out. We also want the physical and the digital archive to mirror each other, and often we'll make the physical copies of completed born digital projects for reference and redundancy reasons. It's also possible there are multiple versions or formats of documents and recordings, which are the completed documents, which are the raw files. That all needs to be sorted out. And then we want to look closer at the content of the collection to see if there are any parts missing. In some cases, I'll encounter projects that have only been partially processed. Many projects opted for an either or approach when it came to logs and transcripts. So surveying the completeness of a project will help determine the next steps in terms of processing. Next slide, please. Accessioning. If one hasn't been made yet, an inventory spreadsheet containing all the information of an interview series is created. Our metadata schema is based on Dublin Core and contains the basic administrative, structural, technical, and descriptive metadata that one would find in most repository records. Best practices for oral history metadata span the entire life cycle of the interview. Ideally, this would not be something filled out during the post-custodial phase, but is done as an ongoing process where metadata is added at the pre-interview, interview, and post-processing phase, and then after with administrative and descriptive elements relating to discoverability and access. Along with detailed metadata, the inventory provides an overview to the entirety of the collection, itemizing the size and the scope of the content. And in the post-custodial phase, the inventory also serves as a guide for processing that collection. Next slide, please. Once it's determined a collection has met criteria for access, sufficient content, metadata, permissions have all been established, we can move on to the processing phase. It's important to note we always maintain a digital copy of the original instance. Records that we received are preserved as they were for reference. Luckily, we have the capacity for ongoing digital storage and preservation well into the future. The process copies are reformatted for access copies and OHM's ingest. It's possible that some collections will require the added step of digitization and restoration to enhance usability. Some collections I've encountered were organized by components, which separated the media from the contextual documents, which isn't very conducive to being a useful, usable, and accessible collection. So part of this process is reorganization of interview files into a consistent hierarchical folder structure, which Brett will talk a little bit later. But essentially it goes fawn, collection, series, interview, session. Once the collection is sorted, documents are reformatted and audited. Files are assigned new file naming conventions. Transcripts are audited, corrected for errors, and time-stamped. Session logs are reformatted into indexes and given segment titles. This is done with access in mind. With indexes, we try to imagine an audience of researchers who might be interested in the interview. We want to make thoughtful summaries and titles that guide them towards the content while providing important contextual analysis of broader historical themes. The act of auditing a transcript for accuracy or indexing an interview for OHMs requires attentive listening to the original audio source. This is not a textual exercise. We listen to the interviews as we're doing this. And so we are able to more efficiently identify errors, fill in vital context, and sometimes find moments where the discussion of sensitive or personal details may prove problematic for immediate and online access. We are always led by the concept of informed accessioning, which asks the questions like, does this interview contain personal information, confidential and sensitive information, criminal allegations, potentially slanderous or libelous language pertaining to another living person, or culturally insensitive language? Thankfully, these instances are somewhat of a rarity, as most practitioners and participants of oral history are aware of these potential liabilities. With attention to the pre-interview phase and informed consent, participants should be aware their interview is intended to be a public record. Sometimes participants will also have the opportunity to review their interview via transcript before it's processed or put online. Any necessary redactions or restrictions are made to the access collection. Those instances are implicitly stated in the transcript and metadata, and the redacted section of the audio will have a tone to indicate a change in the record. During the processing phase, additional keywords or subject headings are also added to the metadata fields if necessary. So once all the documents are processed, access copies are created, transferred, and backed up before they're ingested into OHMs, which brings us to OHMs. Next slide, please. We use the oral history metadata synchronizer to facilitate access to our collections. Developed by Doug Boyd out of the University of Kentucky, OHMs is an open source, free, web-based tool for syncing oral history audio with transcripts, indexes, metadata, images, GPS coordinates, and all sorts of other information in order to provide access, discoverability, and interpretation. So to preface this, the digital age has led to some new approaches in organization of oral history collections towards accessibility through different databases, software, websites. While some of these platforms have enhanced access to oral history collections in new and interesting ways, often the case is the collections are presented as a relatively small targeted group of interviews on a website, or collections that are built on proprietary or custom technologies that ultimately become unsustainable due to budgetary constraints or obsolescence. Furthermore, common archival digital platforms have allowed for simultaneous presentation of an interview recording and transcript, but they're never really, integrated in an intuitive way. So in many ways, OHMS was developed with all those considerations in mind. Next slide, please. So how does it work? Once a collection is processed for OHMS ingestion, an access copy of the interview recording is put on our secure media server, which is linked to the OHMS application. The collection materials, index, timestamp, transcripts, and metadata are ingested into the OHMS application as well. Upon completion, the interview record is exported as an XML file. When this XML file is put on a web server, it interfaces with the content management system by the way of the OHMS viewer. The OHMS viewer is where the user accesses the interview and can review it in a variety of ways. Next slide, please. OHMS combines both textual-based and narrative-based indexing along with timestamp transcripts that are synchronized to the audio source, allowing for the user to search the interview's the transcript in order to find the exact moment in the audio. So with OHMS, you can search for a specific word in the text. For this interview, it's grandmother. You'll be able to find every instance of that word in the interview, and then you'll be able to move to that section in the audio with the timestamps. Next slide, please. With the index, users are given more efficient integrated browse and search mechanism that connects to the corresponding moment in the interview, much like the navigational structure of a book. So an index also creates a very different representation of the content of an oral history interview than a transcript, since indexes attempt to account for both the literal text and what is meant by it. So in instances of interviews where important historical moments are discussed, the added context of the index provides greater access and understanding of the content. So for example, if you jump to a section in a transcript where an interviewee was telling a story about neighbors sharing ingredients for baking at Christmas time, the context and the time period of the story may not be evident, but the index and keywords can tell the user this was due in part because of food rationing during World War II. So this is one example. That's why we believe the more attention and thoughtful processing given to documents like indexes, along with robust metadata, keywords, and subject headings, make for a more useful, usable, and accessible experience for the user. One of the most significant features of OHMS is its versatile platform that can be integrated on almost any system. It's non-proprietary, it's based in HTML, it's free to use and easily transferable. So hopefully it stays that way. Next slide, please. So overall, OHMS fits into our goals of making oral history collections useful, usable, and accessible. We've already heard quotes from oral historians like Michael Frisch that recognizes oral histories have been notoriously underutilized in the archives. Frisch and other prominent oral historians like Alessandro Portelli have argued that the core auditory dimension of oral history hasn't been fully engaged with. When representations and orality serve essential narrative functions to understanding the content of the interview. OHMS combines the valuable auditory and textual components of an oral history collection in a way that facilitates discovery. OHMS has also been an important tool for shaping educational practices, providing students new ways to not only navigate and engage with oral histories, but also contribute to the processing of oral history collections. There's a 2017 article connecting the classroom and the archive that Jenikin Smucker, Doug Boyd, and Charles Hardy talk about their experiences in the classroom using OHMS for a tool for digital exhibition, and curation. So it's useful and it provides users with a valuable framework for engagement where anyone can see the layers of what goes on in an oral history interview and understand the content and build the context, engaging in the kind of curatorial aspects of an oral history collection. However, as Kim stated, the components for achieving archival access to oral history aren't tied to any one platform. It's not the synchronized function of OHMs that makes it valuable, it's the infrastructure of access. The contextual documents, the metadata, the organizational structure of a process collection is easily transferable to other platforms and allows for greater access in the future. That's what's key here. The goal now is to contribute to, the goal now is to continue a process of doing the backlog of collections with a future goal of finding more platforms to help curate, increase discoverability, searchability, while encouraging engagement with our collections. And before I wrap up here, just next slide. Brett mentioned a lot of this, but I should mention kind of like, what we're doing for preservation just quickly. We have redundancy protocols in place to ensure our collections are securely backed up and stored in one more location. We run checksums as part of our processing workflow when transferring digital files and to check for file integrity. And we have a migration plan for digital backups every 5 years. So, we're well set for preservation standards. Now I'll turn it over to Brett to talk about discoverability.
Thanks, Ken. So our efforts in preserving our collections and making them accessible are of limited value if we cannot make the collections discoverable to potential users. If we hope for our collections to be used in research projects or reused in the creation of digital public history initiatives such as story maps or podcasts, users need to be able to easily find and gain access to these collections online. The OHC has explored a number of platforms and alternative options in enhancing the discoverability of our collections for users. Our current focus is on exploiting the robust metadata generated by project participants that we collect at the time of donation. During a pre-custodial intervention at the earliest possible stage of a project, staff inform project leads that fulsome metadata at the collection, series, interview, and session level is essential to preserve and provide access to an archival collection. This metadata is then used in the final step of processing archival collections in the creation of a hierarchical catalog record that presents the collection in the appropriate contexts, links to the digital recordings, transcripts, and indexes, and is made widely available to local and national researchers according to the wishes of the interviewees. Next slide, please. The primary tool that we use to create descriptive catalog records is the Access to Memory, or ADAM, archival description software. ADAM is widely used in the Canadian archival community. It is described on its website as a web-based open source application for standards-based archival description and access in a multilingual multi-repository environment. ADAM incorporates the International Archival Descriptive Standard ISAD-G, as well as the related yet different Canadian standard Rules for Archival Description, or RAD. Over the past 20 years, with the advent of the digital revolution, the Canadian archival community has lamented how the national descriptive standards it employs are not sufficient to describe the elements and contexts of digital records. Consequently, ADAM, which supports these analog-based descriptive standards, also falls short when attempting to create archival descriptions for born digital records. Further complicating this issue for us is the fact that oral history collections do not necessarily map well to archival descriptive standards that emphasize the nested hierarchical structure of the font, series, file, and item. Next slide, please. However, ADAM does offer a few benefits that at this point and with limited options at our disposal has made it a worthwhile product to try to adapt to our specific needs. It offers users and administrators the ability to search and browse all the collections created by a given institution. In addition to a general search box, the system allows for advanced search capability, as well as faceted browsing by a number of fields, including level of description, creator, person or place names, subjects, media or format, and language. While oral history collections may not map well to archival descriptive standards, ADAM does offer that nested hierarchical top-down descriptive structure that is necessary to accurately reflect the structure of oral history projects. The system offers import and export capabilities in commonly used data structures such as XML, meaning our data is not tied to the platform and can be exported and re-imported into future platforms. And a further advantage for ADAM, although it does present challenges as well, is that it has the capability of being used as a multi-repository network or union list of archival descriptions. Next slide, please. Through our membership with the Association for Manitoba Archives, the OHC has free access to their ADAM-based union list, the Manitoba Archival Information Network, or MAIN. The OHC is one of 36 archival institutions in the province with records in Maine. Despite challenges with the bulk import of data and the inability to use the accessions module, MAIN offers additional benefits for discoverability. It allows for various entry points to our collections through faceted browsing, including via Library of Congress subject headings. It also exposes our collections to a much wider audience and allows for serendipitous discovery of our collections through search and browse functions, opening up our collections to researchers who may have previously been unaware of our institution's holdings. In these ways, it allows for greater discoverability of our collections and the greater possibility of their use and reuse. Next slide, please. Our phone level descriptions include information about the creator of oral history projects and cumulative information about the content and context of the projects they created. Our collection and series level descriptions pertain to oral history projects and include content and contextual information, including the dates, physical description, custodial history, scope and content, arrangement, language, location, availability, relations, and restrictions imposed on the interviews. They also include subject and name access points to interviews, including the names of interviewers and interviewees. Interviews are described at the file level and include similar information about an interview's content and context, but also include links to the digitized interview, transcript, and index, reviewing and listening within OHMs. If an interview was conducted over several sessions, the sessions are described as parts of the whole item, and session-specific information, including links to the digitized interview session materials in OHMs, are listed here. Next slide, please. So this slide is reflective of how sorry, just one second. While far from the perfect platform for oral history collections, our adoption of ADAM and MAIN as a vehicle to describe and provide opportunities for discoverability of the oral history collections in our archive is currently our best option. Not only does it allow for discovery of our collections within MAIN, but collections in MAIN are indexed and placed highly in web searches. The data is periodically imported into the University of Winnipeg Library Catalog, allowing for its discovery on this platform, which is then further indexed and made available worldwide through OCLC WorldCat. And the data is also periodically imported into Archives Canada, the ADAM-based national union list of archival descriptions, allowing our collections to be more readily discovered by a national audience. Next slide, please. So in our presentation today, we have made a point of discussing the lesser discussed aspects of oral history, preservation, access, and reuse, with the goal of emphasizing that this is a shared responsibility. By following a pre-custodial approach to building accessibility, usability, and discoverability into their projects, oral history practitioners lay the foundation for access and future use of collections before they arrive at the archives. But archivists and repositories too have a key role in this process in applying these best practices to legacy collections and in vetting and implementing effective systems of discovery and access. Our goal at the OHC is to extend the traditional model of oral history life cycles to more clearly outline the shared labor of practitioners and archives in preservation and access to oral history collections. Our archives workflows reflect the continual, ongoing, and cyclical nature of stewarding oral history collections over time and the labor involved in doing so. Our motto at the center is democratizing history. Although this is typically a phrase that describes inclusion, diversity, and agency of narrators in telling about the past, at the OHC, we are working to democratize access to existing oral history interviews as well. We want the oral history collections under our stewardship to be preserved to ensure they remain authentic, reliable, and usable over time, to be accessible in ways that respect legal and ethical concerns, adhere to technical standards and best practices, and are made available in ways that respect the content, context, and structure of collections in their entirety, and are widely and freely discoverable to a wide audience in formats that allow for ease of use and reuse. Thank you so much for inviting us to speak with you today, and we would be pleased to answer any questions that you may have about the presentation or our work in general.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brett, Kent, and Kimberly. It's been really wonderful to hear the presentation. And we, as you say, we'll be taking questions at this point. We'll do them through the Q&A feature in Zoom. So if people can type their questions into the Q&A box at the bottom, then we'll relay them on to our panelists. We have a couple of starters. So I'll start off with the first question that we have here that actually came through when people registered, which was, how do you protect parts of the interview that the subject would like restricted without restricting the whole record? So that's thinking at the detail level of an individual record. Who would like to tackle that one?
Carefully.
Have you encountered that scenario?
I mean, that question really has to do with the degree of how many restrictions are like within a specific interview. We've encountered interviews where they're just, a few sections that, again, one of my traits is as a sound engineer, so I'll be able to redact those. Like, again, these are access copies for a reason. We preserve the original instance. We have access copies, so there is a degree of curation in what people can publicly access. But we try to make them as accessible as possible. But if that can't be done in any meaningful way, then we'll just restrict that access. But Kim, do you have a 2 cents on that?
Let me figure out how to unmute myself. Everything in oral history is really a process of negotiation. So if it's a matter of redacting a segment of the interview, that's really entirely possible. So if it's a matter of a paragraph or somebody regrets mentioning a name, those things are easy to redact, and it's relatively easy to do the matching work on the audio editing end. So we have to remember that has to take place in 2 different areas. Where it gets more difficult is if people want significant, rewrites and redactions, because it really fundamentally alters that primary source. It becomes a different kind of record. And secondly, because the audio editing work that would be required to make the source match is a lot. It ends up, the labor hours stack up. So the negotiation comes in deciding with interviewees what is a reasonable request, when does it fundamentally change what we've just done in the interview, and whether or not we as a repository or even as a project manager can perform the audio editing work to match it. Is that comprehensive answer?
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. And yes, very comprehensive. The next question that we had was, can you give examples of working with Indigenous partners on oral history projects?
Well, I can give an example of a project that we're currently assisting with. We're through the university archives. We're working on the second phase of a Two-Spirit oral history project. The first phase was done 4 years ago now, I believe, at a international Two-Spirit gathering. Two-Spirit individuals were given training at the center to become interviewers. They went to the gathering and interviewed Two-Spirit people, and those interviews were processed and archived and are now available online, and we're just currently finishing the second phase, which is focusing on elders and knowledge keepers. And we hope to have that second phase of the collection available very soon. Certainly in that project and in others, these projects are being done at the request of the community, with the community's involvement and feedback and guidance at all stages. And that's kind of the key takeaway, of course, when working with Indigenous communities and organizations. And I know we have done some other projects in the past that maybe Kim or Ken want to touch on.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk at length about collaborating with Lorraine Fontaine on several digital story institutes that we undertook. Yeah, I know there's multiple there's multiple partners that we've worked with over the years, so it's kind of hard to narrow down in a meaningful way. But I don't know, Kim, do you have any thoughts?
I think in both cases, and often our approach to doing community-based oral history, whether or not it is specifically with Indigenous groups or not, is to take a community-directed approach, which means we don't partner with somebody and necessarily say, okay, here's what you're going to do. It involves a lot more planning and collaboration, and a willingness to sit down and be told by community members what they need from you. So in both cases, the Two-Spirit oral history collections and with the survivors of residential school stories, that was the model, to be here as a center and to be able to assist without necessarily dictating the process.
Thank you. And that actually segues nicely to a question that was just added, which is, how do community desires of what happens with the oral histories impact the use and reuse life cycle?
I can take that with the preface of community is a tricky word. It's sometimes difficult to define that word or figure out what is the community. But you know, often we work with a representative group, right? And the answer to that is it can impact it in different ways. In oral history, we prefer an approach that would secure permissions on an individual basis. So it is a narrator or interviewee's prerogative to dictate how they will and will not allow the interview to be used, which of course is more work to monitor at an archival level, but that is the best practice. In terms of community access, there are different models of stewardship agreement that Brett could probably speak to more in more detail, but it would be a matter of us as a repository not necessarily owning these records and all of the rights to all of the content. So there are shared stewardship agreements where if our infrastructure is required to preserve the collection, we wouldn't tell a community that they could not use it, right? So it's not an all or nothing thing. Again, it's a process of negotiation and figuring out what assets we can bring that are needed or maybe not needed.
Thank you. Next question, which is there a danger that the oral history metadata synchronizer could also become obsolete? Should there be a solution linked to Wiki Commons? Many university librarians have looked at automated tools to upload digital pictures where there is no danger to copyright issues.
Can I answer this? I know
yes,
I just answered the last one. I'm not sharing. The answer to that is yes. And I'm actually like sort of really proud of kind of where we've arrived as oral historians in acknowledging that. And that's why the way we do things here is the way we do things. If you have all of the pieces, if you have a robust spreadsheet full of metadata, if you have a good filing system, if you have recordings and transcripts and summaries, the risk is worst case scenario, what you lose is access for a certain amount of time until you figure out, you know, what platform to use next. You haven't lost the whole basket. So this has happened. Oral historians have learned this lesson before, and this is why we do things the way we do. Platforms go obsolete. The internet is not an archive. So you want to be able to preserve the building blocks that you can plug into whatever amazing platform comes next. So it's not only a question of platform obsolescence, is that new and wonderful things are being invented all the time. Maybe something better will come along shortly. And you have all the raw materials to just export that spreadsheet into the format that whatever technology requires to ingest it, which even, you know, can include something as simple as a web page. So the reason we do things the way we do it is based on an assumption that everything will be obsolete at one point. There's a second part to that question, which is about automated tools to upload digital photos. So this doesn't really work for oral history. Because oral history is life stories. Like at its core, this is deeply personal information about people that they've allowed us to share. So we do have a really clear archival permissions form that allows us to do that and makes that process very transparent. But it can't be automated because it takes humans. Kent mentioned things like libelous or slanderous content. You know, there's an amount of adjudication required in sharing these legally and ethically that regardless of the copyright status does not hold up to the standard of ethics for oral history and life stories. So legal passability is the low bar. We want to kind of share according to an ethical standard as well.
Thank you. Thank you. So another question we got, how should a historical organization handle it when they have a scattered collection of oral history interviews that not all the proper metadata and information was recorded for years ago, such as there's a release form and a date, but not much other context? Should we add it to our oral histories and move forward with best practices, or should we separate these from our archival ones?
They're kind of describing the process that we're going through at the moment.
I think every repository are going through the same.
Yeah. Maybe, Ken, do you want to?
You know, like right now, again, like the Oral History Center is only roughly a decade old, and we're processing now a lot of born digital collections that are just like completed, or we're just getting to the point where we're surveying. So right now, the inherited collections that we have, we're holding on to them. It might be a accessioning situation. But right now we're going through the process that I already outlined in the post-custodial workflow. There's enough of them that it will take a while to kind of get to the point where we'll have to make that decision. So I don't know how to answer that, because it's basically what we're doing is, again, we're going through the kind of Robertson way of like, what is the easiest way, or where are the easiest collections for access at this particular point? What doesn't, pass that certain litmus test, we hang on to them for another day, and maybe we can, come back to that. But there are a number of collections that need to be processed. So I'm really sorry that we didn't really answer that question. But
I would just add that, if you're planning on preserving anything over time, you have to make sure that it's valuable.
yeah,
So, if you don't find what you have in your legacy collections are of value, then there's no point in going through the process of making sure that they meet the standards for preservation and access. So just kind of doing that appraisal or reappraisal piece at a broad collection level, I think is probably the most important thing to do.
Oh, thank you. And then moving on to the next question, we have, how do you control rights and reproductions of oral histories while balancing digital accessibility, particularly for institutions where film and TV would be interested in reproducing interviews?
that's a good question.
Can I preface it with great difficulty? So this is one of the, so because I work for an institution, it's not necessarily what might be the right thing only for the Oral History Center. It has to occur in a larger context, which I think is true for, many larger repositories. But one of the ways, we're still thinking through this, right? So the way that Archives Canada does this for some collections, which is probably the ethical model, would be to, if interviewees are still alive, is to refer anything to the person in question. So my permissions might state that I can share this for academic research purposes, and then anything outside of that scope, I would have to contact the narrator, put people in touch, or at least ask, like, are you okay with it being used for this purpose? But, it also depends, right? So that obviously can't be done for people who have passed away. So I'm not quite sure how to answer it in that situation, but where narrators are still alive and is sort of beyond the scope of the permissions we've obtained or possible uses we've envisioned, I think the ethical thing to do is refer that request to them.
Brilliant, thank you. Do you anticipate a significant future role for machine learning and artificial intelligence in the processing and searching of oral history recordings?
Does anyone want to talk about the state of transcription software?
I do. One day I'd like to do a workshop called "The AI is Not Sentient," because it's not. There are subtleties to even the process of transcription, and like I described before, there are human activities involved. There's nuance and really human interpretive skill required in a lot of this processing work. AI is getting pretty efficient and smart though. So my hope is that AI is to a point where it can produce a raw transcript that is actually useful in this and, could serve as a rough draft for me to later come and edit. I think that would be the best possible kind of use of that. I don't think it's necessarily wise nor productive to turn the entire operation over to automated processes. We're kind of getting there. It's, the content is getting pretty good, and the more we put into it, the better it's going to get. There are also some ethical questions involved in doing that, though. For example, if an interviewee has said, no, I don't want my interview to be made available in full online, then I would interpret that as, they don't give me permission to feed their whole life story into this software platform that does that. And so a lot of the platforms we use to do automated transcription have like really lengthy user agreements. And if they use platforms like Google or Amazon AI, to execute that function, then we don't actually know what their user agreement is. It becomes kind of murky what we're doing with somebody's words here, whether it's just making the software better, or if it, if it's going to be sort of gleaned for weird, nefarious marketing purposes or something. So if we can't answer those questions, we might want to think twice about doing it.
Yeah, thank you. And kind of related-ish, sort of, in terms of discoverability, how do most people find the oral histories in your archives? Google search, a particular platform?
I would say that we're relatively new to making our collections discoverable in the ways that we are, and we haven't necessarily done an analysis on how people are finding them. We're using Main as our primary platform. The metadata in Main is searched and indexed by Google and is available and is visible in Google searches, but I can't say with any certainty as to how people are finding our collections at this point. That's something we'll have to look into.
Yeah.
And just as a follow-up question, are you keep tracking visits? Are you getting the analytics so that you can do that? So you can look at that later?
Yes, certainly through Main, there is Google Analytics set up on the website. We're also planning to make our collections more discoverable on the OHC website, and we haven't quite got to that point yet, but of course there's analytics set up on that site as well. So yeah, the tools are in place to be able to track where people are coming from, how people are finding their inroads to our collections. We just haven't had the time to do that analysis as of yet.
Yeah. Another question that different tack. So how have you been able to share your structure with potential interviewees? Has it helped engage them with the process as they think about contributing to the oral history?
Yes. Kim can talk about this, but we have done workshops with communities before where they've seen the entire process up front and they understand what this is happening. And like, I think one of the problems you encounter with oral histories and like early oral histories was that phase of the pre-interview phase, the making sure that this is informed consent, that they're on board with it, that everything is transparent and they're working together. Like that, that's kind of a hindrance in making sure that people will want this as an accessible public record. So I think Kim can talk to this way better than I can.
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary of it. I mean, the principle of informed consent really does involve telling people, who are you? What are you doing? Why is it important? What's going to come out of it? What's going to happen long run? And I think now really the only nuanced difference between, kind of old oral history and newborn digital oral history is we really do have to make clear and know now to make clear that the end goal of this, when I'm done with your interview for my project, I would like your permission to archive it so somebody else might find it useful in the future, So we know now to make that really clear. We know that it requires specific detailed permissions and choices provided, kind of apart from that permission to be interviewed. So we realize there's another layer of consent involved in that conversation.
And also to inform practitioners about what's required if they hope to, archive an oral history collection. That's something, of course, that Kim and Kent will always tell folks in their workshops, but when we get requests for donations to the archive, there's no guarantee that those people have been informed previously through workshops with Kim and Kent. So that's kind of that pre-custodial approach where we're able to have a conversation with a potential donor, informing them of what's required for donation to the archive before a project even begins, hopefully.
And I have a question that links nicely to the when you are accepting donations or working with prior collections. So, do you preserve the original organizing principles or metadata that the original practitioner created, in addition to or separate from the description that you add?
Yes, we preserve the original instance of like the digital access copy, or then we process towards an access copy that fits with our naming conventions and folder structure. So we have a partitioned network RAID system that it moves it moves through the levels of access where it's the original copy, hasn't been changed. We process it, then it goes to the access copy. And that's going to be on the other end of things where people can access it. So people, for all, like, again, it's for a reference, but it's not going to be an accessible copy unless it's, the original rights holder wants it. Does that answer it?
We always retain the original recordings and accompanying documentation as master copies, which are preserved, and then we make access copies from those masters that are made available online and for use.
Yeah.
So if I could add, maybe this is too much information, but the reason why we reorder projects into a nested structure, if that is not the case to begin with, is because, I think theoretically in archives, original order of a collection is thought to lend insight into the creation of that collection. However, in the digital age, that is, can I just say, less true? It's chaos. There's like hard drive chaos. And sometimes in order to present an interview within the context of its creation, with, adjacent to other interviews and in the context of a project, we have to sort things out. It's not easy to find anything. So it's a balance in creating usable collections presented in context to still respecting that principle of original order, even though I may see it as chaos.
Right. Thank you.
I talked about how, arranging by component is so counterintuitive to how to access a collection or interview. It's all the elements are there. It's just the organized structure is not. So
right. Yeah. We've got time for one last one, I think, which is video the standard now? Are audio only interviews still conducted for your archive?
Yeah. You want to go ahead, Kim?
Sure. I love this question because I have no horse in this race. It is always a matter of two things, and that is the resources you have and which technology you can use well. So, we're visual despots. We want everything to be video. Whether or not there's clear reason for that is not always, the case. We still operate primarily in audio because it requires less financial and time resources. We have a lot of audio equipment. We're a center that supports learning about oral history, which is, for the most part, an entry-level kind of introduction to oral history. So audio is really good for that because, whether you end up in a place where you have a lot of video resources, you have resources to do video, you will always need good audio recording skills. So that's the foundation we stick with. I mean, I think we would love to have more staff and more financial resources to be able to pursue video in a more meaningful way. Whether or not it's the standard is a little bit more difficult to answer. Because for audio, there are clear archival standards in terms of file types and preservation standards. That's less the case with video. Although we've been put in a position sort of after this pandemic to have documents that are all sorts of file formats like MP4 and streaming file types. We don't know about the archival longevity of those. We do know that even if you want to use those, you know, and edit those files, that can be problematic because of the variable frame rates. And a lot of video file formats are proprietary, which is another obstacle. So it's not, you know, do what you have the resources for. Definitely consult, always like consult an archive if your intention is to archive massive amounts of video. It can be like a video file can be 25 times as large as the equivalent length of audio. So that's a matter of making informed choices, I think.
Thank you. And that's all we have time for today. But thank you so much. I hope everybody will join me in thanking Brett, Kent, and Kimberly. It's been truly amazing presentation, and thank you also for answering all of those different questions in such detail. And yeah, you have our gratitude. Thank you very much.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you. Great. Yeah, thank you, Chris. So just a reminder for everyone that this is part of a series, and the next issue or episode in our series, it will be in January, on January the 18th, and we'll be looking at mapping oral history with atlasine and sensibility mapping, and it will be presenters from the Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling at Concordia leading the show then. So hopefully we will see you there. Thank you very much. And so we'll wrap up the webinar now, and just a reminder that the Innovating with Collections cohort to stay on. Don't go yet. And thank you to everybody else, and we look forward to seeing you on the next presentation. Goodbye, everybody.